We have got nearly 5 million households renting privately in this country. We're talking about a huge group of people who just do not have the protections that they need to stay in their homes. Whether you call it an eviction or not, 4 people moved into a house that they were paying a significant amount of money for. Yeah. They thought they would be in it for a long time. They made a home. Less than a year into that tenancy, they were told it would be sold from under them. They were then told by the agency they were going to be charged nearly £2,000 to repaint the house.
Well, we're joined now in our own newsagent's little abode by Vicky Spratt from the Eye, housing correspondent for the Eye, who broke the story, and Aggie Chambre, of course, friend of the show. Not that you're not a friend of the show, Victoria.
Thanks so much.
Of course. Both friends of the show. Aggie Chambre, LBC political correspondent, is also here. Vicky, just give us the outline of the story.
Well, for anybody who hasn't heard by now about this story, what has happened is that 4 tenants from an East London townhouse contacted me to say that they were asked to leave their property because it was being sold. They then found out that their landlord was Labour's homelessness minister, Rushanara Ali. So they thought that that was a story that ought to be on the record because under Labour's new Renters' Rights Act, which will become law early next year, landlords will not be allowed to put properties back up for rent if they have said tenants have to leave because they are selling them. And what happened in this case is that after the tenants left, they saw the property was relisted very quickly for nearly £700 more a month.
And when you say very quickly, are we talking months? Are we talking weeks?
They say within weeks. That's disputed by the minister.
But it's a relatively, either way, it's not a sort of like year period or 6-month period. It certainly wouldn't be allowed within the confines of this new legislation.
It would be prohibited under Labour's forthcoming legislation. And we at the iPaper sent a reporter, one of my brilliant colleagues, Alex, to knock on the door yesterday to confirm this because the minister had pushed back on it. The tenants said they had been living there for 4 or 5 months. The tenants who contacted me left in March. So
the point of this is that to say that, obviously, big picture, whatever the details, a story which is homelessness minister evicts their own tenants, not ideal. But even worse is that in evicting them in the way that she has, it would in fact be illegal under the government's own legislation which is coming in, which would mean that basically the obvious question is, well, something's wrong here, right? It's either her conduct or the legislation itself.
Well, or there is a third party involved. Of course, the property was managed by letting agents.
But it's her responsibility, ultimately.
Ultimately, as the landlord, yeah. So something has clearly gone very wrong. I would say the minister disputes that these tenants were evicted. They were told the house was being sold, and she says that she offered for them to stay on a rolling basis. They say they asked, that they weren't offered. So the minister's recollection of events differs somewhat from the tenants'
But either way,
recollection of
even
events.
a rolling basis obviously offers very little in the way of security.
Because the house could be sold at any time.
Right.
And, the minister doesn't think she evicted them, but I would say if you're asked to leave, is that an eviction? If you're asked to leave a school, are you expelled? Or have you just been asked to leave? What's the difference? It feels like semantics.
And we'll get we should talk about the politics of it, but just because people might not be familiar with the bill that's coming in, the Labour's Renters' Rights Bill. If that was in place now because it's coming in, what do you believe she may have broken if that law was extant at the moment?
So let's be clear, it's a really good piece of legislation. I think lots of people are very happy that it's coming through. Housing Minister Matthew Pennycook has worked very, very hard on the Renters' Rights Bill.
And you spent years writing about these issues and campaigning on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've spoken to absolutely everybody that I could possibly speak to. I think the general consensus is the Renters' Rights Bill is a very, very important piece of legislation. We have got nearly 5 million households renting privately in this country. That's double what we had when Labour were last in power. We're talking about a huge group of people who just do not have the protections that they need to stay in their homes. The key thing that this bill will do is ban what's called a Section 21 no-fault eviction, which is where you can pretty much be evicted at any time in a tenancy without having done anything wrong. But it will also make it harder for landlords to throw people out if they're selling up. And if they are going to sell, they are allowed to take the property back. But the reason this provision exists where you cannot relist it for rent within 6 months is to close a loophole where they can say, oh, I've got to sell it, ask the tenants to leave, and then put the rent up.
And the suspicion is, or it could be said, that there would be at least a suspicion that that is what the minister may have done here?
Look, the property was listed for sale until this morning when it seems to have been taken down. So it certainly, she has been trying to sell it. It has been listed for sale. It was up for nearly £1 million and then it was reduced earlier this year. So she certainly has been trying to sell it. But nonetheless, the fact remains, the tenancy agreement I saw from the tenants who left earlier this year, were evicted, left, however you want to put it, were paying £3,300 a month. It then went up to nearly £4,000 a month.
When it was relet?
Yeah.
Aggie, what number 10 saying about this?
Well, so you've touched on it there, Vicky. It's really difficult, isn't it, when two people are saying slightly different things? And also the crux of the story, as you very much have said, is also the fact that what she seems to have done would have been illegal in a bill that's coming forward early next year, in the sense that if a landlord ends a tenancy and regains possession, they're banned from reletting, marketing for letting, or granting any occupancy licence for a restricted period of 12 months. But I guess the trouble is, and this is the point that has been made by MCLG, by the department too, is if they are saying that they were on a fixed term contract, but then then the fixed term contract ended, and then they offered them this rolling contract, which the people you have spoken to deny. But then isn't it the point as well that a fixed term contract is also going to become illegal under the Renters' Right Bill?
Absolutely, we won't have fixed term contracts anymore.
So it'll all be illegal.
Yeah.
So everything she's done.
But let's just be fair to the minister for a moment. Fixed term contracts are the norm. They've been the norm since the 1988 Housing Act. She's not done anything wrong by having a fixed term contract. But I think this case highlights the instability of those contracts and how they can make it very easy for landlords to have flexibility to put rents up.
Okay, so like what I think what we can agree, right, what we could say is that clearly there is this clear legal question about what would have happened if this had happened in the future when this had come in. But politically, right? I mean, this is a very crude way of putting it. It's not completely true. But nonetheless, homelessness minister makes people homeless, or at the very least has people leave. You know, it's not ideal, is it? I mean, it's not completely ideal. What's your sense of what Labour MPs think about it?
No, it's not ideal. And also, of course, as Vicky will know, she has spoken on the record numerous times as homelessness minister about how important it is that people don't become homeless, how private renters can be really, really difficult
for them. And Labour
them.
slammed a lot of Tory MPs, many of whom there are far more buy-to-let landlords on the Tory benches, certainly in the last Parliament, than there are Labour. It's more typical with Tory. And they, rightly, when occasionally these stories come along which exposes an MP as, I'm not saying this was the case in this case, a slum landlord, but, who'd been a bad landlord in whatever way, they absolutely rightly slammed them. And when you've got a homelessness minister, I'm almost surprised she was made a minister in that department, given she had buy-to-let obligations.
2 buy-to-lets, by the way. 2 rental properties according to the Register of Interest.
So that is something that came up again and again when I spoke to Labour MPs earlier today about this story. The fact that it is obviously more unusual statistically for a Labour MP to own a number of houses, let alone a number of buy-to-let houses that they are then renting out. And I think that, for the Labour MPs I spoke to at least, that makes them slightly uncomfortable. And then there's Vicky's story itself. And I mean, I'm just going to read out some quotes. These are Labour MPs who have read the story, read Vicky's story, thought about it and responded. The first words, says this Labour MP, that came into my head were toast. It just reads as massively bad form. Most Labour MPs are going to look very, very unfavourably on this. And then there are the questions from this Labour MP about whether or not she will be inevitably shifted out after this. So questions about whether she potentially might lose her brief, or whether there is, everybody expects, going to be a reshuffle of more junior ministers at some point, potentially in the next month or so. Questions about whether she will go in that, or whether she might go before that. From the conversations I've had kind of from the government side, it doesn't sound like it. Another Labour MP says, very, very bad, not sure how stable her position is. Another, difficult to see how she survives, TBH, especially she's already had most of her brief taken off her. That, as you may know, will be a reference to the fact that she used to be a Grenfell minister. She went along to a conference last year, and this was part of her brief in the job she's in now. She went along to a conference. It was the Franco-British Colloque, a conference that brings together senior politicians, civil servants and business leaders. And the person that co-chaired that conference recently served as chairman of Saint-Gobain, the parent company of one of the firms that was heavily criticised in the recent Grenfell inquiry. So she went along to that, and then campaigners from Grenfell called for her to lose that brief, which she then did. So Labour MPs, I mean, pretty consistently, a couple of them that I phoned up said, I don't want to talk about this because I don't know all the details. Everyone else I spoke to thought she would go. or potentially not now, but potentially in the next reshuffle. And they also said what might help her is the fact that it's August, so not everybody is talking about this in PCH, or they said any WhatsApp group with fewer than 10 Labour MPs in it, they are talking about this.
And the Tories have called for it to go, of course. But not just this, I mean, you would expect that. But I know as well, there are Labour, I mean, you've spoken to a load, it sounds like, of Labour MPs talking off the record. But there are Labour MPs talking about it publicly, right? Kim Johnson, left-wing Labour MP, has criticised it. Other people in the Labour Party, Jess Barnard, who's a member of Labour's National Executive Committee, says, seems an appropriate time to reiterate that MPs should not be landlords and landlords should not be Labour MPs. Now, that's obviously quite, you could argue that's quite an extreme position, but I think it again highlights this would be doubtless be if this were a Tory government and a Tory minister, it would be a problem. But there is something for Labour MPs and the Labour Party. It just sits so congenitally, it's kind of uncomfortably, right? Even the idea of being a buy-to-let landlord, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but it just sits with great difficulty. And as I say, I'm amazed they managed to find like the one. I mean, there can't be that many Labour MPs with certainly more than one buy-to-let property, and yet they managed to find one of them and make them a housing minister.
I suppose it's important to point out that she is not the minister with responsibility for renting. That is Matthew Pennycook. But nonetheless, she's at the department responsible for this huge shift in rebalancing the power between renters and landlords. Such a huge shift, may I point out, that it could not get through under the Conservatives because it was so contentious amongst their backbenchers, many of whom are landlords. So Labour promised to come in, get this through without any controversy. They've done that, but this is just a terrible look.
And it is actually, I mean, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because it is one of those things that the government has done, and I can think of a few examples of this, which are way more radical and way more significant than perhaps A, they get credit for, or B, that we discuss very often, right? Because, it's often obviously a common critique of the government that they are, they're directionless, they're rudderless, they don't really talk about what they're doing. This is, you say, Vicky, it's a substantial transfer of political power, ultimately, from people with property to people without property, something that has been called for years and years and years as the renting crisis and whatever has got worse and worse. And yet you have this, which basically it's the thing that's getting attention, but it's also sort of undermines that profoundly big shift.
Well, I think that's really key, Lewis, and actually stakeholders, including ACORN, the National Tenants Union, the Renters Reform Coalition, which is a group including Generation Rents, Shelter, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, really important people that MHCLG has had at the table during all of the discussions about this legislation. ACORN are calling for her to resign. The Renters Reform Coalition, who are normally a lot more measured, said this just undermines the point of the whole bill. And I think you've got a situation where actually renters do feel really hard done by. They feel really insecure.
So.
They've been ignored politically for a really long time. And let's not lose sight of what has actually happened here, regardless of the semantics, whether you call it an eviction or not. 4 people moved into a house that they were paying a significant amount of money for. Yeah. They thought they would be in it for a long time. They made a home. Less than a year into that tenancy, they were told it would be sold from under them and they should leave. That's what has happened here. And that's why there is so much resentment, I think, towards landlords, politically and culturally. So the optics of this are just very bad.
I was just going to say, because I think we've kind of all touched on it. Is this one of those cases where the optics are really bad? It looks really bad. I've spoken to loads of Labour MPs today who says, she's toast. This is really, really terrible. But the point that the department makes is it's in line with the law. Would it be this bad if the Renters' Rights Bill wasn't coming in, or would it just look bad?
If the Renters' Rights Bill wasn't coming in, I think you'd still have people saying it was very bad. But I mean, we've got to work with the reality we have, which is this legislation is coming in. It's coming from her department.
And also, you could look at it the other way, right? Look at it from you just mentioned various renters associations and interest groups. If you were a landlord group or a landlord, and you're sat there going, well, hang on, you've built up a business or whatever on the basis of this legislation which exists. And then the government is making, as you say, a really radical change to the legislative framework and the way that operates and the way your business operates. And on the basis of a moral case, that this is the right thing to do because there's been too much power for people like you and not enough power for these people. And then you see one of the ministers who on some level is responsible for that, albeit it's not directly her brief, but nonetheless she's in the department, basically doing the thing, arguably, doing the thing that you're being told you ought not to do, and then that's bad for you to do, then you'd be pretty pissed off as well, right?
Well, I note that landlords have been very, very, very quiet. My phone has been absolutely blowing up today.
Well, maybe they're keeping their heads down,
I've
which
not
is what all
heard-
Roshanara might need to do.
I've not been hearing from any landlord associations, and normally they're very quick to get in touch, and I think they don't want to say anything.
I thought they might. I thought they might.
Well,
criticise
they've
it from the
worked
other-
very hard with Angela Rayner, with Matthew Pennycook on this legislation. They want to stay in the room, I'd imagine. It's very, very difficult because it looks like a case of do as we say, not as we do. And I would point out, she's not the minister responsible for renting. That's true. She is the minister responsible for homelessness and eviction. As the government themselves have said, quoting Shelter, the housing charity, is a leading cause of homelessness. The end of a private tenancy is a leading cause of homelessness. Define homelessness. I speak to people week in, week out, who in very similar circumstances to these 4 people have to leave a privately rented home and cannot find anything else they can afford. Where do they end up? Knocking on the door of their local authority, asking for support, moving back in with parents, moving in with friends, sofa surfing. There is a direct link between what has happened here and people becoming homeless. It is a clear link.
And at the very least, as anyone who's had a tenancy of that nature knows, and who has been told that it's coming to an end in these sorts of circumstances, even if you are a person of means, when you're told that, and you have a relatively limited length of time to find somewhere else, with the rental market being, as we all know, what it is, particularly in cities like London, the fear, at least, of homelessness, they're like, well, what happens if I can't find somewhere by X date and this, is there, right?
Right. And I should say also, I've spoken to one of the tenants in this group of people. 3 of them don't want to talk about it because they're so worried about all of the attention it's getting.
And they might not be able to get another home.
Well, quite. It'd be very difficult to rent. The other one, who I have spoken to, Laura, I don't think she took any pleasure in this at all. I think she thought about it for a really long time.
And she just felt the hypocrisy.
And then got in touch because she told me, she said, I voted Labour for change. And this is wrong.
And what about when you said to her that, did you point out that obviously with the legislation coming in, there is going to be change?
Yeah, but that doesn't change her situation now, does it? She had to move.
When did she find out that Roshanara Ali was an MP and was her landlord?
I think they started Googling the name on their contract once they were told they were going to have to leave, which was about 8 months into their tenancy.
And then realised, that must have been quite a moment.
Well, there was something else that happened too, which is in the story that I wrote for the iPaper, which is they knew that, I think, before they were then told by the agency they were going to be charged nearly £2,000 to repaint the house. And then they showed me the checkout report. I've been through it with a fine-tooth comb. The pictures that say that it required repainting show some cobwebs, a couple of spiders, tiny mark on the wall.
They were going to charge them £2,000.
Yeah. And
Which
then
itself, right, is going to be made illegal under the legislation.
That's already illegal.
That's already illegal.
Under the Tenant Fees Act 2019, Lewis.
What, and the estate agent who were managing it said that they had to pay it anyway.
Well, what happened was they disputed it because
Right.
you're allowed wear and tear. You're not allowed to charge tenants for. So that's a scuff here and there, paint fading, dust.
Yeah.
But what you can charge is serious damage. So what happened here clearly is they were alleging that serious damage had occurred to the extent that it needed repainting to the tune of, I think it was nearly £2,000, just shy. And the pictures clearly don't show that. They knew that Roshanara Ali was their landlord. They emailed the agency. They said, look, the homelessness minister is our landlord. She's a Labour MP. Perhaps you shouldn't do this or we will go to the press. In the tenant's words, the charges then mysteriously disappeared. But I understand from people close to Roshanara Ali that what happened is that she was then told about it. She didn't know about it up until that point, and she intervened so that the charges would be cancelled.
Well, we should say that we have approached Roshanara Ali for an interview. I'm sure you've done the same thing, and she has declined. But there is always a space open. There's always an availability for a tenants agreement of our own, and to bring Roshanara Ali into this studio, and we can ask her about it. Vicky, thanks so much for a great story, very interesting story. Oh, actually, before we go, you probably won't want to answer this because you're going to be too virtuous. But Aggie, do you think she survived?
I think from the conversations I've had today, not with people in government, but with Labour MPs, she probably survives until the reshuffle. And I wonder whether she doesn't survive beyond that reshuffle. But that could happen. any minute now, but
well
probably
done
in September.
Well done for resisting the temptation to say she's going to be evicted from the government, which I unfortunately was not able to do. Victoria?
You cannot resist a pun, Lewis.
It's not really a pun, it's more of a pathetic wordplay.
Technically, I suppose. I mean, I would say, actually, not too virtuous to answer this at all.
Go on then. Okay,
I think that when you've got a government department, Ministry of Housing, which is actually, I would argue, one of the most functional departments in this government, actually delivering on stuff that they said they would do. Planning reform, again, the Tories couldn't make that happen. Renters reform, the Tories couldn't make that happen. Kept saying they would.
Haven't abolished leasehold yet, have they?
No, but they're working on that. And in fairness to them, legally that is a disaster, and they are on it. I think you've got a department that's actually getting the job done. They don't cause a fuss. They do lots of great work that doesn't make headlines because stories like this tend to make more headlines. So having somebody at that department who is doing things that will be in direct contravention of their legislation means she probably should go.
I guess the only counterpoint to that is if she is one of the cogs in the machine that is making that department work well and is doing stuff behind the scenes, maybe they think, we don't hear about it loads, maybe we just can't lose her.
Of course we don't know, and I would love to hear those stories. If they want to get in touch and share some of those good news stories with me, I'll absolutely take a look.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.